This is lesson 2.18, Maroon Societies and Autonomous Black Communities. In this lesson, we'll be describing Maroon communities, which were made of self-emancipated people, meaning those who had escaped enslavement, that functioned separately and autonomously in hidden locations throughout the African diaspora. These communities were completely independent, living on their own terms, although they were often threatened by enslavers. And in many cases, they went to war with those enslaver societies in order to defend their autonomy and freedom. So there were Maroon societies all throughout the African diaspora. We already know that they played a role in the Haitian Revolution, for example, but we're going to look at three specific places in the Americas where we can kind of compare and contrast the characteristics of these independent Black societies. The first one is Quilombo dos Palmares in Brazil. Nestled into the forested hillsides of eastern Brazil, Quilombo dos Palmares was one of the longest-lasting Maroon societies and was home to free Black people for nearly 100 years. The residents of this community built shelters and public structures and provided for themselves in complete self-sufficiency. Children were born free here, protected by a community that was prepared to defend itself, a disproportionate number of residents having been soldiers in Africa. The majority of enslaved Africans brought to this region originated in West Central Africa, in what is now Angola, where you might recall there were several powerful kingdoms, which were called Congo, Matamba, and Ndongo. And perhaps you remember this warrior queen of Ndongo, who led her people in a guerrilla war against the Portuguese. And perhaps you may get candy if you are the first person in this class to tell me her name after this video ends. But in any case, the point is that many of the people in Quilombo dos Palmares had freedom fighter ancestry, so it shouldn't be a big surprise that they became freedom fighters themselves. In fact, the very word Quilombo comes from a Bantu word used in Angola, which means war camp. The next Maroon Society we'll look at is in Jamaica. And I say is because it's still there and it's still inhabited by the descendants of free Maroons. The society centers on Moortown, which is tucked into the mountains on the eastern side of the island. Mountainous terrain often provided good cover for Maroon societies to thrive, as it was more difficult to find them amidst the rugged landscape. Groups of Maroons in Jamaica would often launch attacks against British colonial forces. If the title of this painting is to be believed, Maroons who likely lived in Moortown conducted ambushes as far away as Trelawney Parish, suggesting that their reach probably extended across the entire island. It's important to note that these were not slave rebellions. They were wars between free and independent societies, one of which was outnumbered as well as outgunned and needed to use guerrilla tactics to maintain its freedom and independence. As it had been in Ndongo, the Maroon Wars in Jamaica are also associated with female leadership, specifically a woman named Queen Nanny, who is so revered in Jamaica today that she appears on their $500 bill. The last of the Maroon communities we'll investigate today is the closest to home, right here in the United States. It bears the name of the Great Dismal Swamp, and while that's hardly the type of thing you would put on a postcard, it's actually a fairly accurate description. For one thing, it is great, at least in the sense of big. Situated on the border between Virginia and North Carolina, the swamp would have covered an enormous 2,000 square miles in the 18th century. It is most certainly a swamp, complete with waist-deep water and every kind of nasty creature you can think of. And life there must have been dismal at times, with food and medicine in short supply, not to mention the constant threat of capture. But people did live here, and they did so on their own terms, free and independent of the capitalist enslaver society outside. They maintained their linguistic and cultural traditions and blended them into new ones. They raised families and knew that their children were their own. And when fugitive slaves arrived, headed north on the Underground Railroad, they sheltered them and gave them refuge before they continued their journey. They were the true embodiment of resistance and the resilience of an indomitable people who would not submit to slavery.